Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to have the chance to speak to you this morning. This is the last part of a mini-series that you're doing on Revelation chapter 1. We'll start just by reading the passage together, shall we? Revelation chapter 1, and we're going to read from verse 9 onwards. I, John, your brother and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Jesus, was on the island of Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. On the Lord's day I was in the Spirit, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet, which said, Write on a scroll what you see, and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. I turned round to see the voice that was speaking to me, and when I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And among the lampstands was someone like a son of man, dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet, and with a golden sash round his chest. The hair on his head was white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and coming out of his mouth was a sharp, double-edged sword. His face was like the sun, shining in all its brilliance. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Then he placed his right hand on me and said, Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades. Write therefore what you have seen, what is now, and what will take place later. The mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand, and of the 7 golden lampstands, is this. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. Well, it seems odd not to be with you in Silverton this morning, because we're usually there at least once a week, whether it's redelivering grandchildren or doing guitar lessons or whatever it happens to be. But not this week because of social distancing, and I bet you're finding it's a bit frustrating as well, not being able to get everywhere you want to be. John, who wrote these words, was like that, and he was in this place. This is the island of Patmos, just off the coast of Asia. He was about 40 miles or thereabouts from the place that he loved, the place where he worked, where the churches were, that in the rest of Revelation he writes his vision to. And he has a separate letter for each of the churches. He's sitting here, though, just wondering what on earth is going on. He's been exiled to Patmos. It's not a dreadful place to be in, actually. Patmos was an island where, well, there were some facilities, because it was the last stop on the boat from Rome through to Ephesus. And so there were ships passing through all the time. There was a fair amount of civilization there. It wasn't a dreadful place to be exiled to, but it was social distancing. You couldn't be with your friends. You couldn't be with the people you cared about. And John has a vision in this passage of someone who holds all of the answers to the questions that are starting to bedevil his mind. You may well be going through similar sort of questions at the moment. What is God doing? Why do we need to be distanced from one another like this? How are people getting on, especially those we care for in other parts of the world? I'm worried right now about people who are in Spain and people who are in Austria, whom I work with every year, who live in towns that I know really well. And what's going on there, I can hardly imagine. And John must be feeling dreadful about some of the places that he knows in Asia, which are probably not doing too well. And then he has this vision. And there's somebody standing there, behind him actually, who suddenly speaks and shows him what's really happening. Andy spoke last week, didn't he, about what Jesus has done and what Jesus will do. And I think this vision is given to John to remind him what Jesus is doing. And in situations where we don't know what's going on, where we may feel completely helpless, Jesus is still at work. So I guess there are really 3 things to look at in this passage this morning. I just want to look at them very briefly with you. It's a letter, as I said. It's the start of the letters to the 7 churches in Asia. There are the 7 of them. And Patmos is the little island that you can't quite see it on the left-hand side there. You can see the moss bit sticking through, can't you? But that's where Patmos is. about as far from the churches as Silverton is from Plymouth, I guess. Pretty close, so near and yet so far. And John has this vision in which he's told, write this down. You're going to need to tell this to people when you go back to Asia. It's the truth about what's really going on in the situation, and you need to know this. We need to know it too, which is why it makes sense to study it this morning. At times when you just don't understand what's happening in the world, where it seems that God is a long way away, where it seems that he's working against himself, he's not. Jesus is still in command of the situation, and so the three things we're going to look at this morning remind us about that. The three things are these. First of all, how he looked. What did this person look like in the vision? Second, who was he? He says certain things about himself further on down the passage, as you might have noticed. And he ends by talking about what he wanted. What's John got to do? Let's look very, very briefly indeed at some of those things. First of all, how he looked. Well now, there is too much here, there really is, to talk about this morning. There's an exact description of exactly what John saw. And every detail has a meaning. That's important because sometimes, when we're telling a story about a weird experience we've had, we fill in lots of details, but just to make it sound realistic. I was sitting there, it was 10:30, I know that was when it was because the news had just finished on TV, and then I heard this noise which seemed to come from outside the house. It seemed to be somewhere just outside the kitchen window. And you go on telling the story with lots of details, but the details themselves don't actually mean anything very much. Now, one thing you find about Revelation is that John knew his Bible very, very well indeed. And every single detail in what he saw here and in everything else that happens in the book of Revelation ties back to what God has already written in the Bible over and over. And so every detail of what he saw has a meaning. Now, we don't have time to go into it, as I said. So instead, I've put a sheet on the website, which you can download, and it gives you a little bit more detail about what John actually saw and what it means. But for the moment, let me just concentrate on three things. First of all, the first thing that John hears is a sound. It's the sound of a voice, a loud voice, like a trumpet, coming from behind him. And it gives him a start, because this sudden trumpet voice clearly carries authority. It's a voice you can't ignore. It's too loud for a start. But also trumpets have an important role to play in the Bible. You look up trumpet in Bible Gateway and you'll see when God sounds a trumpet, it's an important occasion. He sounded a trumpet when the Israelites met him at Mount Sinai, first of all. He's going to sound a trumpet when Jesus comes again, and every time the second coming is spoken about, you'll probably find that trumpet reference is used as well. So John knows he's listening to something important. But it wasn't a trumpet, it was a voice that sounded like a trumpet. So clearly this is somebody who's speaking the direct words of God, announcing some big change in God's relationship to the world, in a way that this is not the end of the age, it's not the trumpet itself, but it's the sound of the trumpet. This is a message from God that cannot be ignored. What's the second thing? Well, the second thing, it seems to be, is his dress. He's in a full-length white robe, which was a sign of royalty and authority in those days, and it had a golden sash going across it. Why that? Strange fashion choice? Well, not really, because as John knew, and as his hearers would know very well, this is how the official dress of Aaron, the great high priest, is described in the Old Testament. And Jesus is the great high priest. He's the one who is God's ultimate priestly authority. And so as the vision appears dressed like that, it's pretty obvious what's going on here. This is Jesus, and he's God's priest. And third, there's what he's holding in his hand. He's holding 7 stars in his hand. What's all of that about? Well, the 7 stars represent the angels of the churches. And that's been disputed by commentators many, many times. But what it clearly means anyway, whatever the actual meaning of the angels is that he's holding in his hand all of the authority, all of the concerns of the churches themselves. And in Greek, it's an unusual case that's used here. You see, if you normally said you were holding something, you'd use the genitive case. You'd say, I am holding of the. Like, for example, this here. This is a beer mug, which is one of Jess and Ella's little tricks. And if you're holding it in your hand, you normally hold it by the handle. You don't hold the whole thing in your hand. You couldn't get it all in your hand anyway. If you're holding money in your hand, however, you probably have your hand clasped tight over it, especially if you're a Scotsman. So the Greeks, when they were talking about holding something tightly in your hand, used the accusative tense. Now, Jesus here, holding the stars in his hand, is holding them in the accusative, not the genitive. In other words, he's not just holding them up a bit like that. He's got them firmly clasped in his hands. Every detail of the life of all of his churches matters so much to him, he's got it firmly clasped in his hand. Silverton Evangelical Church will never be let go by the Lord Jesus. That's what the Greek is telling us. So what do these three things tell us together? Well, first of all, the voice of the trumpet tells us that Jesus, who's just appeared to John, is God's ultimate prophet. He speaks the words of God. He announces what God is going to do. But he's God's priest as well. What was the job of a priest? The priest had the job of standing in the middle between God and human beings and bringing the two of them together. And so as God's priest, he brings us back to God. And he's the king as well. That's what the holding the 7 stars in his hand is all about. He's the one who has absolute rule and authority over his people. He's the head of the church. And so Jesus is prophet, priest and king. And we're safe with him. And all of this John gets just in a glimpse as he turns round and sees the details of the person who's standing behind him. But there's not just how he looked, there's also who he was. Because he says some things about himself as well, doesn't he? For one thing he says, I am the first and the last and the living one. Now that's important, because this is again going back to the Old Testament. In Isaiah chapter 44, for example, God says about himself, I am the first, I am the last. You people of Israel, you're in exile now in the land of Babylon, but remember that none of these Babylonian gods count for a row of beans. I'm the one that starts things off. I'm the one that finishes things. And Isaiah 44, if you remember the passage, goes on to talk a lot about how crazy it is just to take a piece of wood from the forest, carve it into shape, cover it in silver and gold, and then bow down and worship it. It's daft, because that God is not living. And so God says, I am the living one. That's what's different about me from the other gods of the nations. And now this figure, standing before John, says, listen, I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I am the same in authority to God the Father himself. That's why you can trust me. He also says, though, I was dead, and look, I'm alive forever. I'm not just the God of the ages, but at one point in history, I came into time, and I died on a cross for you. I know what it's like to be a human. I know what it's like to die. And look, I've triumphed over death because I'm alive now forevermore. And so my resurrection is the guarantee of your resurrection, and death need have no longer any terrors for you, because I'm alive forever. And the third thing he says is this, I hold the keys of death and hell. Not only have I escaped the clutches of death myself, but I can let you out of jail. There's a story about an old Negro preacher who, preaching about this and pretending to be Satan, said, he's gone, he's escaped, and he's taken the keys with him. And that's exactly what Jesus has done. He's got out of jail, and he's taken the keys. And so, because he's the first and the last and the living one, he's saying this, you can be confident because of my authority. I'm the first. I was there in creation. Without me, nothing was made that was made. I was there right from the beginning. And I'll be right there through to the end. I am the last. I'm the end of the story. Wherever you go in the world looking for meaning and reality and happiness and contentment, you always end up with me, because I'm the end of the story. I'm the first and the last. I have that authority. Second, you can be confident because of my experience, because I died for you. What does that mean? 'Tis mystery all, said Charles Wesley. The immortal dies? Huh? And yet he did. Jesus died with real nails and real blood on a real cross. And because of that, we can be set free. Do you remember what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15? If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then our faith is vain. We're believing a fantasy. But now is Christ risen from the dead, he says. And because Jesus is resurrected, we know we'll rise again. His new life guarantees ours. And so whatever happens with coronavirus, however those statistics keep shooting up over the next few weeks, we know that we're safe in his hands. Nothing will happen to us in this life in which he is not working for our good. And when we go out of it, we know we're safe in his hands for eternity. We can be confident though too, because he holds the keys of death and hell. And here he's saying, you can be confident because of my power. It wasn't I just escaped from death by some kind of fluke or accident, some one-off, never to be repeated thing. I bust the gates open so that you can walk out too. I'm in charge to that extent. So Jesus and who he was is something we've got to remember while all of this stuff is going on around us, because what he's doing now is important and real. And that takes us on to the third thing, what he wanted. He wanted John to go and write what you've seen. You'll be going back to Asia. People need to know what I've given to you. And you know, God never gives us a vision simply to satisfy our curiosity or bless us alone. He always intends us to bless other people with it, to do something with it. And this is one thing that we need to remember about the coronavirus problem, isn't it? It gives us a new chance to show the love of God and give the message of Jesus and the hope of the gospel to other people too. That's why in Wuhan, in the first days of people being struck down, Christians were around on the streets handing out 30,000 masks to people on the street, donating others to hospitals, showing the love of God in any way they could. That's why in Singapore, when the virus came there, Christians immediately started reaching out to the poor immigrant labourers, the people in Singapore that nobody really paid much time and attention to, and making sure that they were all right, that they were safe, that they had the resources they needed. That's why just over the last week, we've seen in Notting Hill in London, this church, St Peter's Notting Hill, going out to the streets around Portobello Road and the whole area around Notting Hill with a loudspeaker and blasting out Amazing Grace to all of the flats and houses round about, inviting people to join in, to find the words on their mobile phone and sing along, and then inviting them too just to join in with the Lord's Prayer with the vicar. And the vicar, the Reverend Pat Allerton, said, look, I don't expect you to be preached at this morning. I just thought we needed a little bit of hope. At the end, on his way out, he got applauded by people from the landings and the flats and the windows all around him, because he just brought the hope of Jesus to the area. And he says this in his sermon this week: we have a message of good news at these challenging times that we cannot keep to ourselves. Let's be honest, we'll never get a better opportunity than right now. We'll never get a better opportunity in our lifetimes to share what we believe with a friend or a loved one. I've been amazed and surprised by friends and people who've reached out to me, asking for help, asking if they can find out or hear a bit more about Christianity and the gospel. It's just extraordinary who's getting in touch. We're not becalmed at the moment. We're just in another phase of God's plan for us. And Jesus isn't doing nothing. He's not leaving us to it. He's there. He's the Lord. He's the one who's holding the keys. He's the one whom we need to proclaim to everybody around us. It may not be the best thing in a Devon village to go out and blast the neighbourhood with Amazing Grace, but I'm sure you can think of ways in which you can stand up to extend the message of hope to other people, even while we're all socially conditioned and living on our own little island of Patmos. God bless you.